The room fell silent as Dr. Carter doubled over, his laughter echoing against the sterile white walls of the examination room. Claire's cheeks burned red, but her expression remained firm, her small hands gripping the edge of the examination table. The young girl had just calmly rattled off a diagnosis for her own mysterious illness, words no 11-year-old should even know how to pronounce. Her mother, Karen, sat stunned in the corner, clutching her purse tightly as the doctor wiped tears from his eyes. "You really think you've figured out your own condition?" Dr. Carter chuckled, barely managing to compose himself. "And what did you do? Google some symptoms? Watch a medical drama?" Claire raised her chin. "No, Dr. Carter. I read your textbook, the one on rare genetic disorders. And I'm telling you, I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It explains the hypermobility, the pain, and the bruises that keep appearing." The laughter stopped as Dr. Carter froze. His eyes narrowed as he finally looked at the girl, not as a child, but as something else entirely. How do you know about that?" he whispered, his tone now tinged with disbelief. Before Claire could answer, the door burst open. A nurse rushed in, her face pale. "Doctor, there's an emergency in room 3. We need you now." Dr. Carter stood, still shaken. He glanced back at Claire, his mind racing, then hurried out the door. Karen looked at her daughter, eyes wide with a mix of pride and fear. "Claire, what's happening?" Claire shrugged, her face calm. "I think he's about to find out that I'm not just a little girl." 2 weeks earlier, Claire sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by stacks of books and printouts. Most kids her age spent their free time texting friends or playing video games. But Claire had always been different. Since the age of 6, she'd been devouring medical journals and taking notes like a med student. Her obsession began after her father passed away unexpectedly from an undiagnosed condition. While her mother struggled with grief, Claire turned to learning, determined to understand what had happened and why no one had seen it coming. But it wasn't just curiosity that drove Claire now, it was survival. For the past year, her body had started betraying her in ways she couldn't explain. Her joints ached constantly, sometimes dislocating without warning. Her skin bruised at the slightest touch, and she developed strange scars that didn't make sense. Her doctors dismissed it as growing pains or anemia, but Claire knew better. She just had to prove it. One night, after weeks of research, she stumbled upon a rare condition, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. The symptoms matched hers perfectly, but it was incredibly uncommon. She knew convincing anyone, especially an adult, would be nearly impossible. Still, she had to try. The next morning, Claire cornered her mom in the kitchen. "Mom, we need to see a specialist," she said, sliding a binder full of notes across the table. Karen looked at her daughter in disbelief. "Sweetheart, you're 11. You don't even know what half these words mean." "Yes, I do," Claire insisted. "And I need you to believe me. Please." Karen hesitated but eventually relented, making an appointment with Dr. Carter, a well-respected pediatrician. She hoped that would put Claire's mind at ease. Little did she know, her daughter was about to prove everyone wrong. When they arrived at Dr. Carter's office, Claire wasn't nervous. She carried her binder like a shield, ready to defend herself. Karen, on the other hand, felt her stomach twist in knots. "Just let the doctor do the talking, okay?" she whispered as they sat in the waiting room. Claire didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the door to the exam room, her mind replaying every argument she prepared. Dr. Carter greeted them warmly, his smile genuine. "Claire, it's nice to meet you. What seems to be the problem?" Claire launched into her symptoms, explaining each one with clinical precision. Dr. Carter nodded along, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Well, Claire, that's quite a list. Let's run some tests and see what we find." But Claire wasn't done. "I already know what it is," she said, her voice steady. "It's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome." Dr. Carter blinked, then laughed. "That's quite a leap, young lady. You know, even most doctors wouldn't jump to that conclusion without evidence." "I have evidence," Claire shot back, pulling out her binder. "And I can explain it to you." What followed was a 10-minute lecture that left Dr. Carter speechless. Claire detailed the genetic markers, the types of collagen involved, and the diagnostic criteria she believed she met. By the time she finished, Karen was staring at her daughter like she'd never seen her before. Dr. Carter, on the other hand, was still processing. His laughter had been replaced with a frown as he flipped through her binder. "Where did you learn all this?" he finally asked. "I taught myself," Claire replied. "Because no one else would listen," Dr. Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Claire, you're obviously very smart. But diagnosing a condition like this takes more than just reading a book. I'll humor you, though. We'll run some tests and see if you're right." Claire nodded, her confidence unshaken. "Thank you." The next week was a blur of blood tests, imaging scans, and consultations with specialists. Dr. Carter seemed skeptical at first, but as the results trickled in, his demeanor began to change. Each test supported Claire's theory, and soon, even he couldn't deny the possibility. By the time Dr. Carter delivered the final confirmation, his tone was no longer dismissive. "Claire," he said, looking her in the eye, "you were right. You have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome." Karen gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Claire simply nodded, her face calm. "I know." Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Do you realize what you've done?" Claire tilted her head. "I just did what you're supposed to do." I looked for answers. Before Dr. Carter could respond, the nurse interrupted with the emergency call, leaving the conversation unfinished. But as Claire watched him leave, she knew this was only the beginning of her story. As Claire and her mom left the office, the weight of the diagnosis began to sink in. Karen was overwhelmed, struggling to process what it all meant. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell me you were going through all this?" she asked as they walked to the car. "I tried," Claire said softly, "but you didn't hear me." "No one did." Karen stopped, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Claire. I should have listened." "It's okay," Claire said, squeezing her mom's hand. "But now we have to figure out what comes next." Karen nodded, her resolve hardening. "We will. Together." But as they drove home, neither of them could have predicted what was coming next. An event that would test Claire's newfound strength and push her abilities to their limits. Claire had barely settled into her new reality when the next shock came. The following morning, while Karen was on the phone arranging follow-ups with specialists, Claire overheard her mother mention a geneticist at a prestigious university hospital who had expressed interest in Claire's case. "Wait," Claire interrupted. "What geneticist?" Karen, caught off guard, covered the phone receiver. "Dr. Emily Morgan. She's one of the best in the country. Dr. Carter referred us." "Isn't that great?" Claire's stomach tightened. "Why do we need to see another doctor? We already know what's wrong." Karen knelt down beside her. "Honey, you've been through so much. Dr. Morgan might be able to give us more answers, better treatment options. Don't you want to feel better?" Claire nodded reluctantly, but something about the situation left her uneasy. She returned to her room, sinking into her chair and pulling up her laptop. The more she researched Dr. Morgan, the more impressed she became. A pioneer in her field, Dr. Morgan had published groundbreaking studies on rare genetic disorders. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would be more than just a consultation. A week later, Claire and Karen arrived at the university hospital. The building towered over them, its sleek glass facade reflecting the early morning sunlight. Claire gripped her binder tightly as they made their way to the genetics department. Dr. Morgan greeted them in her office, a warm smile on her face. She was a tall woman with sharp features softened by kind eyes. "Claire," she said, shaking the girl's hand, "I've heard so much about you. Dr. Carter says you're quite the expert." Claire smiled faintly. "I just read a lot." "Well," Dr. Morgan said, motioning for them to sit, "that's how all great doctors start. Now, let's talk about you." For the next hour, Dr. Morgan asked questions, reviewed Claire's test results, and even flipped through the binder Claire had brought. The geneticist seemed genuinely impressed, nodding thoughtfully as Claire explained her theories. "You have an incredible mind," Dr. Morgan said at last. "But Claire, I need to ask, are you ready for what comes next? Living with Ehlers-Danlos isn't easy." "I know," Claire replied, "but I've already been living with it. Now I just have a name for it." Dr. Morgan smiled. "Fair point. Still, I want to run a few more tests. There's a new study I'm working on, and I think you'd be a perfect candidate. Karen looked hopeful, but Claire hesitated. What kind of study? Dr. Morgan leaned forward. It's a trial for a new treatment. It could improve your quality of life significantly. Claire's eyes narrowed. And the risks? There are always risks, Dr. Morgan admitted. But I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think it was safe. Claire looked at her mom, searching for guidance. Karen squeezed her hand. It's your decision, sweetheart. Claire took a deep breath. I'll think about it. Over the next few days, Claire couldn't shake her doubts. Something about the study didn't sit right with her, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Late one night, she decided to dig deeper. Using a combination of medical databases and forums, she uncovered troubling details about the trial. It was still in its early stages, and several participants had experienced severe side effects. Worse, the treatment seemed to work only on a very specific subset of patients, those with a rare genetic mutation that Claire wasn't sure she had. The next morning, Claire confronted her mom in the kitchen. Mom, we can't trust Dr. Morgan. Karen frowned. What are you talking about? The study. It's dangerous. I read about it last night. Claire, you can't believe everything you read online, Karen said, clearly trying to stay calm. Dr. Morgan wouldn't suggest it if she didn't think it was safe. That's what I thought too, Claire said. But I found some of her papers. She's under pressure to prove this treatment works. What if she's using me to boost her results? Karen's face softened. Sweetheart, I know you're scared, but we need to trust the experts. You've done so much on your own, but now it's time to let someone else help. Claire's frustration bubbled over. You still don't believe me. Even after everything, you think I don't know what I'm talking about. Karen looked stunned. That's not what I meant, Claire. Before she could respond, the phone rang. Karen answered, her face growing pale as she listened. When she hung up, her voice trembled. That was Dr. Morgan's office. They want us to come in right away. At the hospital, the atmosphere felt tense. Dr. Morgan greeted them, her usual warmth replaced with a serious expression. Claire, we need to talk. What's going on? Karen asked. Dr. Morgan hesitated before answering. We received some additional test results. Claire, there's something unusual about your case. Your Ehlers-Danlos isn't like the typical forms we see. It's linked to a mutation we've never encountered before. What does that mean? Karen asked, panic creeping into her voice. Dr. Morgan sighed. It means Claire is unique. Her condition might help us understand not just Ehlers-Danlos, but other genetic disorders too. That's why I think the study is so important. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. You don't care about me. You just want to study me. Dr. Morgan's face fell. Claire, that's not true. I want to help you. But yes, your case could change everything we know about genetics. Before anyone could say more, an alarm blared overhead. A nurse burst into the room. Dr. Morgan, we have a critical situation in the ER. They're asking for you. Dr. Morgan nodded, standing quickly. Excuse me for a moment. As she left, Claire turned to her mom, her voice shaking. You see, I'm not a patient to her. I'm a project. Karen looked conflicted, but before she could respond, another nurse entered the room. This time, her focus was entirely on Claire. Claire, we need you. Right now. Both Claire and Karen stared at her in confusion. Me? Claire asked. Yes, the nurse said, urgency in her voice. Dr. Morgan's patient is coding, and she said you might be able to help. Claire froze. The nurse's words didn't make sense. What do you mean? I'm just a kid. I can't help with something like that. The nurse's expression was serious. Dr. Morgan insisted. She said you'd know what to do. Karen stepped in, her protective instincts kicking in. Wait a second. What is this? My daughter is not a doctor. Why would she be asked to help? The nurse glanced nervously at the door, clearly torn. Look, I don't have time to explain everything, but Dr. Morgan told me Claire has an extraordinary understanding of rare conditions. The patient she's treating has a genetic disorder, something very similar to what Claire has. Please, just come with me. Claire looked at her mom. Mom, I think I should go. Karen's eyes widened. Claire? No. This isn't your responsibility. But what if I can help? Claire said, her voice firm. What if I know something they don't? Karen hesitated, torn between protecting her daughter and letting her make her own decision. Finally, she sighed. I'm coming with you. The nurse led them down a maze of hallways, the hospital bustling with activity. When they reached the ER, it was chaos. Nurses and doctors swarmed around a young boy lying on a gurney, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Machines beeped frantically as Dr. Morgan barked orders. What's the situation? Claire asked, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. Dr. Morgan turned, relief washing over her face. Claire, it's a 14-year-old boy, Leo. He has a rare connective tissue disorder, likely a variant of Ehlers-Danlos, but we've never seen anything like this. His lungs are collapsing, and his body isn't responding to the usual treatments. I thought, maybe you could offer some insight. Karen stared in disbelief. She's just a child. What are you expecting her to do? But Dr. Morgan wasn't listening. She handed Claire the boy's chart. Claire, please. Claire hesitated for only a moment before flipping through the chart. She scanned the notes quickly, piecing together the story. Leo had been admitted 2 days ago with chest pain and shortness of breath. The doctors had suspected a spontaneous pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, but every intervention they tried had failed. Now, both lungs were collapsing, and his oxygen levels were dropping fast. Claire's mind raced. She thought back to her endless nights of reading and studying, searching her memory for anything that might fit. Then it hit her. It's not just Ehlers-Danlos, she said, her voice steady. It's vascular Ehlers-Danlos. The blood vessels and connective tissues in his lungs are too fragile. That's why the normal procedures aren't working. Dr. Morgan's eyes widened. If you're right, what do we do? Claire swallowed hard, her heart pounding. You need to stabilize the lungs without putting too much pressure on them. A standard chest tube won't work. It'll cause more damage. You have to use a smaller catheter and insert it with extreme caution. And he'll need constant monitoring to make sure the pressure doesn't drop too low. Dr. Morgan nodded, turning to the team. You heard her. Let's move. The next few minutes were a blur. The medical team scrambled to follow Claire's instructions, carefully inserting the catheter while monitoring Leo's vitals. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone held their breath, waiting to see if it would work. Finally, the machines stopped their frantic beeping. Leo's breathing stabilized, and his color began to return. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Dr. Morgan turned to Claire, her face a mix of awe and gratitude. Claire, you just saved his life. Karen was speechless, her hand covering her mouth as she watched her daughter. Claire, how did you know that? Claire shrugged, her voice quiet. I just read about it once. I didn't even know if it would work. Dr. Morgan placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. It worked because you trusted your instincts, and because you're brilliant. The ride home was silent. Karen kept glancing at Claire in the rearview mirror, struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. Claire, what you did back there, it was incredible, but it was also dangerous. You're not a doctor. You shouldn't have to carry that kind of responsibility. I know, Mom, Claire said softly, but if I hadn't said anything, Leo might not have made it. Karen sighed. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I really am. But we need to figure out where to go from here. You can't keep doing this on your own. Claire didn't respond. She stared out the window, her mind replaying the events of the day. She had saved a life, but the weight of that realization was heavier than she expected. What if she had been wrong? What if her advice had made things worse? When they got home, Claire went straight to her room, shutting the door behind her. She sat on her bed, clutching her binder tightly. For the first time, she felt the pressure of the path she had chosen. Being right had saved Leo, but it also meant she couldn't pretend to be a normal kid anymore. People were starting to expect things from her, things she wasn't sure she could handle. That night, as she lay in bed, Claire's phone buzzed. It was an email from Dr. Morgan. Subject, You're remarkable. Claire hesitated before opening it. The email was short but heartfelt. Claire, I can't thank you enough for what you did today. Leo is stable because of you. I know this is a lot for someone your age to handle, but you have a gift. If you're willing, I'd like to mentor you. You have the potential to change lives, not just as a patient, but as a future doctor. Let me know if you'd like to talk. Dr. Morgan. Claire stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. She wanted to help people, but was she ready to step into a world where so much was at stake? Before she could decide, a knock on her door startled her. Karen poked her head in, her face unreadable. Claire, we need to talk. Claire sat up, her heart racing. What is it? Karen stepped inside, holding a letter. This came in the mail today. It's from the school district. Claire's stomach dropped. What does it say? Karen unfolded the letter, her hands trembling. They want to know why you haven't been attending classes. And they're threatening to report us if you don't go back. Claire's heart sank. As much as she had tried to balance her medical research with school, it had become nearly impossible. Now, it seemed her two worlds were on a collision course, and she had no idea how to stop it. Claire stared at the letter in her mom's hands, her mind racing. School. In the middle of everything else, she'd nearly forgotten about it. For months, she'd been balancing her medical research and health issues with online classes, but the strain had caused her grades to slip. The letter was proof she couldn't ignore it any longer. What do they want us to do? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. They're saying you either need to return to school immediately or provide medical documentation for why you can't. If we don't comply, they might report us for truancy. Claire felt a pang of guilt. I didn't mean for this to happen, Mom. There's been so much going on. Karen's face softened. I know, sweetheart. You've been dealing with things no 11-year-old should have to. But we need to figure this out together. Do I have to go back? Claire asked, her voice small. The thought of sitting in a classroom, surrounded by kids who couldn't possibly understand what she was going through, made her stomach churn. Karen sighed. I don't know, Claire. If we can get a doctor's note, they might let you finish the semester online. But even then, we'll have to prove you're keeping up with your studies. Claire nodded, already forming a plan in her head. Dr. Carter or Dr. Morgan could write the note. They know what's going on. Karen frowned. I'm not sure about Dr. Morgan. After everything that happened at the hospital, I don't know if I trust her intentions. Claire looked down at her hands. She emailed me last night. She said she wants to mentor me. Karen's eyebrows shot up. Mentor you? Claire, she's a world-renowned geneticist. What exactly does she mean by that? I don't know, Claire admitted. But she said I have potential to help people. Karen shook her head, her expression a mix of pride and worry. Claire, you've already done so much, but you're still a kid. You shouldn't have to carry all of this on your shoulders. I don't want to stop, Claire said firmly. Helping Leo. It felt right, Mom. Like this is what I'm supposed to do. Karen studied her daughter for a long moment before sighing. Let's take it one step at a time. I'll call Dr. Carter tomorrow and see if he can help with the school issue. But Claire, I need you to promise me something. What? No matter what happens, you'll talk to me. About everything. I can't help you if I don't know what's going on. Claire nodded. I promise. The next morning, Karen called Dr. Carter's office while Claire buried herself in her studies. She had started looking into other cases of vascular Ehlers-Danlos, hoping to find more information that could help people like Leo and herself. A few hours later, Karen knocked on her door. Dr. Carter said he'll write the note. He's sending it to the school today. Claire felt a wave of relief. Thanks, Mom. Karen hesitated, then added. But he also suggested you start seeing a counselor. He's worried you're taking on too much. I don't need a counselor, Claire said quickly. I'm fine. Claire, you've been through a lot, Karen said gently. It's okay to need help. Claire didn't respond, pretending to be engrossed in her laptop. Karen sighed and left the room, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. Later that evening, Claire received another email, this time from Dr. Morgan. Claire, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to let you know that Leo is recovering beautifully, thanks to you. The entire team is still talking about what you did. I can't help but wonder how many more lives you could impact with the right guidance. If you're open to it, I'd like to invite you to the lab. I think you'd find the work fascinating. Let me know if you're interested. Warm regards, Dr. Morgan. Claire stared at the email, torn. She wanted to trust Dr. Morgan, but her mom's warning echoed in her mind. Could she really trust someone who saw her as a case rather than a person? Before she could decide, Karen appeared in the doorway, holding a letter. Claire, we got another one. This time, it's from the hospital. What now? Claire asked, exasperated. Karen handed her the envelope. Claire opened it, her heart sinking as she read the words. Dear Claire, in light of your extraordinary contributions during a recent emergency, we would like to formally invite you to join our youth medical mentorship program. This program is designed for gifted individuals like yourself who have demonstrated exceptional potential in the field of medicine. We understand this is an unconventional step, but we believe your talents are extraordinary. The program involves shadowing doctors, attending specialized classes, and contributing to ongoing research. If you're interested, please contact us at your earliest convenience. Best regards, University Hospital Administration. Claire's head spun. First the email from Dr. Morgan, and now this? It was everything she dreamed of, and yet, it felt overwhelming. Karen sat beside her. What do you think? I don't know, Claire admitted. It's a lot. Karen nodded. It is. But Claire, you don't have to decide right now. Take some time to think about it. I don't want to stop helping people, Claire said quietly. But I'm scared. Karen wrapped her arms around her daughter. It's okay to be scared. Just remember, you're not alone in this. The next day, Claire returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but as an observer. She had agreed to visit Dr. Morgan's lab to see what the mentorship program was all about. As she walked through the doors, her heart pounded in her chest. Dr. Morgan greeted her with a smile. Welcome, Claire. I think you're going to love this. The lab was a whirlwind of activity. Researchers bustled around, analyzing samples and discussing data. Dr. Morgan led Claire to a workstation where a group of scientists was studying a new imaging technique for identifying genetic mutations. This is cutting-edge technology, Dr. Morgan explained. It could revolutionize how we diagnose conditions like yours. Claire listened intently, fascinated by the possibilities. But as she watched the researchers work, a nagging thought crept into her mind. Was this really where she belonged? Before she could dwell on it, an alarm blared, sending everyone into a frenzy. Dr. Morgan grabbed Claire's arm. There's been an accident in the lab next door. Stay here. I'll be back. But as the chaos unfolded, Claire's instincts kicked in. She couldn't just stand by. Without thinking, she followed the sound of the alarm, her heart racing as she stepped into the unknown. The alarm's blaring grew louder as Claire entered the neighboring lab, her heart pounding in her chest. Scientists and technicians scrambled to contain the situation, shouting instructions over the noise. Smoke filled the room, and the acrid smell of burning chemicals stung her nose. What happened? Claire called out to the nearest person, a frantic lab assistant. A containment breach, the assistant yelled back. A chemical compound spilled, and someone collapsed. We're trying to clear the area, but we can't move them until the fumes are under control. Claire's eyes darted to the center of the room, where a figure lay motionless on the floor. Her stomach twisted. Isn't anyone helping them? The assistant shook his head. The air's toxic. We're waiting for the ventilation system to kick in. Claire's mind raced. If they waited too long, the person might not survive. She glanced around, spotting a set of emergency respirators near the door. Without hesitating, she grabbed one and pulled it over her head. Wait, the assistant shouted. You can't go in there. It's too dangerous. I have to, Claire said, her voice muffled by the mask. Just tell me what to do when I get them out. Before anyone could stop her, she darted into the smoky room. The air was thick and heavy, but the respirator kept her breathing steady. She reached the fallen scientist, a young woman in a lab coat, and quickly checked for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Claire grabbed the woman under her arms and began dragging her toward the exit, her legs trembling with the effort. Every step felt like a marathon, the weight of the scientist combined with the oppressive heat making it nearly impossible to move. But Claire refused to give up. Finally, she reached the door, where several people were waiting with a stretcher. They lifted the woman onto it and rushed her to safety. As Claire pulled off the respirator, coughing and gasping for air, Dr. Morgan appeared, her face pale with worry. Claire, what were you thinking? You could have been hurt, or worse. I couldn't just stand there, Claire said between breaths. She needed help. Dr. Morgan's expression softened, a mix of frustration and admiration. You're brave, Claire. Maybe too brave. After the chaos subsided, Dr. Morgan led Claire to her office, insisting she rest for a while. Karen, who had been called as soon as the alarm sounded, burst into the room moments later, her face a mixture of relief and anger. Claire Elizabeth Harper, Karen exclaimed. What were you thinking? I'm sorry, Mom, Claire said quietly, but I couldn't let her die. Karen sighed, sinking into a chair. You're 11 years old, Claire. 11. You shouldn't have to make decisions like that. Dr. Morgan stepped in, her tone calm. Karen, I understand how you feel, but your daughter saved a life today. She showed incredible courage. Karen shook her head. I don't want her to be in situations where she has to be brave. She's a child, not a hero. Claire looked at her mom, tears welling in her eyes. Mom, I'm not trying to be a hero. I can't ignore it when I know I can help. Karen wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tightly. I know, sweetheart, but you need to let others help you, too. Dr. Morgan watched the exchange, her expression thoughtful. Karen, I think it's time we talked about what Claire's future looks like. She's not like most kids, and that's not something we can ignore. Karen pulled back from the hug, her eyes narrowing. What are you saying? I'm saying Claire has an extraordinary gift, Dr. Morgan said, but it needs to be nurtured. The mentorship program would give her the tools and guidance she needs to make a real difference. Karen hesitated, torn between protecting her daughter and supporting her dreams. I don't want her to lose her childhood. She doesn't have to, Dr. Morgan assured her. We'll work at her pace. But Karen, you've seen what she's capable of. Don't you think the world deserves to see it too? Claire looked between her mom and Dr. Morgan, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she wanted anymore. The weight of everyone's expectations felt like a storm brewing inside her. That night, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day played over and over in her mind. The scientist collapsing, the panic in the lab, the moment she decided to act. She had saved a life, but at what cost? She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, heavier than ever. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Leo's mom, whom she'd met briefly in the hospital. Hi, Claire. It's Leo's mom. I just wanted to say thank you again for saving my son. He's doing so much better now, and it's all because of you. You're an angel, sweetie. Never forget that. Claire stared at the message, her emotions swirling. She wanted to help people like Leo, but how could she balance that with being a kid? Was it even possible? The next morning, Karen and Claire sat at the kitchen table, discussing the mentorship program. It's your decision, Claire, Karen said gently. But whatever you choose, I'll support you. Claire took a deep breath, her mind made up. I'll do it, but only if we set some boundaries. I want to help people, but I also need time to figure out who I am. Karen smiled, tears in her eyes. That sounds fair. Dr. Morgan was thrilled when Claire told her the news. You won't regret this, Claire. You're going to do amazing things. But as Claire prepared to step into this new chapter of her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the beginning, and that even bigger challenges lay ahead. She had no idea how right she was. Claire's first day in the mentorship program was a whirlwind. The university hospital bustled with activity, and she felt like a tiny boat navigating a vast ocean of knowledge. Dr. Morgan had assigned her a mix of observation hours, research projects, and shadowing opportunities with various specialists. The schedule was intense, but Claire thrived on the challenge. Her first assignment was to observe a pediatric surgeon, Dr. Patel, during a routine appendectomy. Claire stood on a raised platform in the operating theater, watching as the team worked with precision. Dr. Patel glanced up at her once, a friendly smile behind his surgical mask, before returning his focus to the patient. Claire was mesmerized. The sterile environment, the steady hands, the teamwork. It was everything she'd imagined and more. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of excitement that momentarily pushed aside her self-doubt. After the surgery, Dr. Patel invited Claire to his office. "So, what did you think?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "It was amazing," Claire said, her eyes lighting up. "I've read about surgeries, but seeing it in person is so different." Dr. Patel chuckled. "It's a lot to take in, especially at your age. But you handled yourself well. Dr. Morgan tells me you're quite the prodigy." Claire blushed. "I'm just trying to help people." "That's a good attitude," Dr. Patel said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself too. Medicine is a demanding field, even for adults." "I'll remember that," Claire promised, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Claire spent her days juggling her mentorship responsibilities and online school assignments. Her nights were filled with reading medical journals and reviewing what she'd learned. The pressure was intense, but Claire felt like she was making a difference until the cracks started to show. One afternoon, Claire joined Dr. Morgan for a genetics consultation with a new patient, a 6-year-old girl named Lily. Lily's parents were visibly distraught as they described their daughter's symptoms: chronic pain, frequent bruising, and delayed wound healing. Claire couldn't help but notice how much Lily reminded her of herself. "Lily's symptoms suggest a connective tissue disorder," Dr. Morgan explained gently. "We'll run some tests to confirm, but it's possible she has a rare form of Ehlers-Danlos." Lily's mother broke down in tears, and her father clenched his fists. "What does that mean for her future?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Morgan hesitated. "It's a lifelong condition, but with proper management, she can live a full life." Claire watched the exchange, her chest tightening. She wanted to speak up, to tell Lily and her family that they weren't alone, but the words wouldn't come. She felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just for herself, but for everyone like her. That night, Claire broke down for the first time since joining the program. Sitting on her bed, she buried her face in her hands as the weight of everything came crashing down. Her mom found her like that, tears streaming down her face. "Claire, what's wrong?" Karen asked, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I can't do it, Mom," Claire sobbed. "It's too much. Everyone expects me to be this genius, but I'm just a kid. I don't know if I can handle it." Karen held her tightly, her own tears threatening to spill. "Claire, you're allowed to feel overwhelmed. You've been carrying so much, and it's okay to ask for help." "I don't want to let anyone down," Claire whispered. "You won't," Karen said firmly. "You've already done so much, Claire. But you don't have to do it alone. Let me and Dr. Morgan and everyone else support you." Claire nodded, her heart heavy but a little lighter knowing she wasn't alone. The next day, Claire hesitated before bringing up her concerns to Dr. Morgan. "Can we talk?" she asked nervously. Dr. Morgan set aside her clipboard. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I'm struggling," Claire admitted. "I love helping people, but I feel like I'm drowning. It's like everyone expects me to have all the answers and I don't." Dr. Morgan smiled gently. "Claire, no one expects you to have all the answers. You're here to learn, not to be perfect. And you're allowed to take breaks. It doesn't make you any less capable." Claire felt a lump in her throat. "I just don't want to fail." "You won't," Dr. Morgan said, "because you care. And that's what makes you extraordinary." Just as Claire began to find her footing again, an unexpected crisis shook her world. She was reviewing lab data in Dr. Morgan's office when an urgent page came through. A patient was crashing in the ICU, and the staff needed all hands on deck. Claire followed Dr. Morgan to the ICU, her heart racing. The patient was an elderly woman with a rare genetic condition that had caused sudden organ failure. The room was chaotic as doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize her. Dr. Morgan turned to Claire. "Stay here and observe. This is going to be intense." But as the team struggled to save the woman, Claire noticed something odd on the monitors. Her blood pressure readings were inconsistent with the suspected diagnosis. Claire scanned the patient's chart, her mind racing. "It's not her organs," Claire blurted out. "It's her blood vessels. They're collapsing because of a microaneurysm." The room went silent as everyone turned to look at her. Dr. Morgan frowned. "Claire, are you sure?" Claire nodded, her voice steady. "It fits the symptoms. You need to check for internal bleeding." Dr. Morgan hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Let's do it." Get the imaging team in here now. Minutes later, the scans confirmed Claire's theory. The woman was rushed into emergency surgery, where the aneurysm was repaired just in time. When Dr. Morgan returned, she looked at Claire with a mixture of awe and concern. "You just saved another life," she said. "But Claire, you can't keep putting this pressure on yourself. We need to figure out how to balance your gifts with your well-being." Claire nodded, but deep down, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Every success came with higher stakes, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the challenges were only beginning. The ICU incident sent ripples through the hospital. Word spread quickly about how an 11-year-old had correctly identified a life-threatening condition in the middle of a crisis. Doctors were impressed, nurses were skeptical, and administrators were intrigued. But for Claire, the attention only made things harder. Everywhere she went, people whispered about her. Some looked at her with admiration. Others seemed to question why she was there at all. Claire tried to focus on her work, but the weight of their stares and murmurs clung to her like a shadow. One afternoon, Claire was called to Dr. Morgan's office for what she thought would be a routine check-in. Instead, she found a group of hospital administrators waiting for her, their suits crisp and their expressions unreadable. Karen sat in the corner, her face tense. "Claire," one of the administrators began, "we've been monitoring your progress in the mentorship program, and it's clear you have an exceptional mind." "Thank you," Claire said cautiously, unsure where this was going. "However," he continued, "your involvement in recent emergencies has raised some concerns. While your contributions have been remarkable, there are legal and ethical boundaries we must consider." Claire's stomach sank. "What does that mean?" Another administrator spoke up. "It means we're reviewing whether it's appropriate for you to continue participating in situations with such high stakes. We're also concerned about the pressure this program might be putting on you." Claire glanced at Dr. Morgan, who looked conflicted but didn't intervene. Karen finally broke the silence. "If you're worried about her well-being, that's valid. But Claire loves this work. Taking it away from her would do more harm than good." The first administrator hesitated. "We're not saying she has to stop entirely, but we need to set clearer boundaries. No more emergency situations, for one." Claire's heart sank further. "But I've helped people in those situations," she said. "Why would you stop me from doing that?" "It's not about your abilities," the administrator said gently. "It's about liability. You're incredibly talented, but you're still a minor. If something were to go wrong, it would be on us." Claire clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. "So I'm just supposed to watch when I know I could help?" Dr. Morgan finally spoke, her tone measured. "Claire, they're not saying you can't help at all, but they're right that we need to protect you. Let's find a way to channel your talents in a way that doesn't put so much pressure on you." Claire wanted to argue, but she knew they wouldn't change their minds. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "I'll do whatever you want." For the next few weeks, Claire was relegated to low-stakes assignments, reviewing case studies, analyzing data, and observing non-critical procedures. It was important work, but it felt like a step backward. The thrill and purpose she had felt in the ICU and ER were gone, replaced by a growing sense of frustration. Even at home, things felt different. Karen was more protective than ever, checking in constantly and reminding Claire to take breaks. Claire appreciated her mom's concern, but it only added to her feeling of being caged. One evening, Claire received a text from Leo's mom. "Hi, Claire. Leo wanted me to thank you again. He says you're his hero. Also, we found a support group for kids with Ehlers-Danlos. Maybe you'd like to join?" Claire stared at the message, unsure how to respond. A support group? She had spent so much time being the expert, the helper, that she hadn't considered seeking help for herself. The idea felt strange, but also comforting. After a moment, she replied, "That sounds great. Can you send me the info?" The first support group meeting was held in a small community center. Claire was nervous as she and Karen walked in, but the warm smiles of the other attendees put her at ease. The group consisted of kids and teens with Ehlers-Danlos, along with their parents. Everyone took turns sharing their experiences, and Claire was struck by how much she related to their stories. When it was her turn to speak, Claire hesitated. "I'm Claire," she began. "I was diagnosed recently, but I kind of figured it out on my own before that." One of the older teens, a boy named Ryan, grinned. Classic EDS move. We're all unofficial medical detectives here. The group laughed, and Claire smiled for the first time in days. She continued, I'm in this mentorship program at the hospital, and I've been helping with research and patient care. It's been amazing, but it's also a lot. Another girl, Mia, nodded. I get it. People expect you to be strong because you know so much. But sometimes it's just overwhelming. Claire felt a wave of relief. For the first time, she didn't feel so alone. As the weeks went by, the support group became a lifeline for Claire. She found comfort in knowing there were others who understood her struggles, and their encouragement gave her a renewed sense of purpose. But just as things began to settle, a new challenge emerged. One day, Dr. Morgan called Claire into her office with an urgent expression. Claire, we've discovered something unusual in your genetic profile, she said. What do you mean? Claire asked, her heart racing. Dr. Morgan handed her a file. It's a mutation we haven't seen before, something unique to you. It could explain why your symptoms are different from typical Ehlers-Danlos cases. Claire scanned the file, her mind spinning. What does this mean for me? We're not sure yet, Dr. Morgan admitted. But it could have implications for your treatment, and possibly for others as well. Claire's chest tightened. So, I'm a guinea pig now? No, Dr. Morgan said firmly. You're not a guinea pig. But this discovery could help a lot of people. I wanted you to know because you deserve to be part of the conversation. Claire nodded, her emotions swirling. She had always wanted to make a difference, but this was bigger than anything she had imagined. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready. The weight of Dr. Morgan's revelation clung to Claire like a heavy cloak. A unique mutation? Implications for others? The words echoed in her mind long after she left the hospital. At home, she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the genetic profile Dr. Morgan had given her. Karen sat across from her, her expression unreadable. Sweetheart, how are you feeling about all this? I don't know, Claire admitted. It's like I'm a puzzle no one can solve. Karen reached for her hand. You're not a puzzle, Claire. You're a person, a brilliant, compassionate person, and you don't have to figure this out alone. Claire nodded, though her thoughts were a storm. She couldn't help but wonder. Was this why she was so drawn to medicine? Had her condition somehow made her more empathetic, more curious? Or was it just a coincidence? Over the next few days, Dr. Morgan shared more details about the mutation. It affected a specific protein responsible for collagen production, which explained why Claire's symptoms were more severe and unusual than typical Ehlers-Danlos cases. But the real shock came when Dr. Morgan proposed an idea. Claire, she said during a meeting, your mutation presents a rare opportunity. If you're willing, we could use your genetic data to develop a targeted treatment, not just for you, but potentially for others with similar conditions. Claire's eyes widened. A treatment? Like a cure? Not exactly, Dr. Morgan said, but it could significantly improve quality of life. It's experimental, and there are risks. That's why we'd need your full consent. Karen, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. What kind of risks? Dr. Morgan hesitated. There's always a chance the treatment won't work or could cause side effects. But we'd take every precaution to ensure Claire's safety. Karen turned to Claire. What do you think, sweetheart? I don't know, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to help people, but what if something goes wrong? Dr. Morgan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You don't have to decide right now. Take all the time you need. Claire spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. On one hand, the treatment could change everything, not just for her, but for countless others. On the other hand, the thought of being a test subject made her stomach churn. She turned to the support group for advice. During their next meeting, she shared her dilemma with the group. That's a tough one, Ryan said, scratching his head. I mean, if it works, it could be amazing. But it's your body, your call. Mia nodded. No one should pressure you, Claire. Whatever you choose, we're here for you. Their support gave Claire some comfort, but it didn't make the decision any easier. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Could she live with herself if she didn't take the chance to help others? And what if she took the risk and it backfired? The tipping point came one afternoon when Claire visited Leo. He was doing much better, but his recovery had been slow and painful. As they played a board game in his room, he suddenly asked, "Claire, do you ever wish you were normal?" Claire paused, the question catching her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I think about how much I've learned because of what I've been through, and how I've been able to help people like you." Leo smiled. "You're the coolest person I've ever met. I bet if anyone can figure out a cure, it's you." Claire's heart swelled. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. The next day, Claire met with Dr. Morgan and Karen to give her answer. "I'll do it," she said firmly, "but I want to be involved every step of the way. This is my life. We do this together." Dr. Morgan smiled, admiration shining in her eyes. "That's very brave, Claire. I promise we'll keep you informed and take every precaution." Karen, though visibly nervous, nodded. "If this is what you want, I'll support you. But Claire, if it ever gets to be too much, you can stop. No questions asked." "I understand," Claire said. "Let's do this." The treatment process began with weeks of preparation. Claire underwent additional tests, imaging scans, and consultations with specialists. The hospital assembled a team of top researchers and doctors to oversee the trial, and Dr. Morgan made sure Claire was included in every discussion. As the day of the first treatment approached, Claire's nerves grew. The support group rallied around her, sending encouraging messages and even a care package filled with snacks, books, and a stuffed animal named Collie the collagen bear. On the morning of the treatment, Karen drove Claire to the hospital. The ride was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Dr. Morgan greeted them with a reassuring smile. "Are you ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Claire replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. The treatment itself was a series of infusions designed to target the mutated protein in Claire's body. The procedure was painless, but the hours stretched on as the team monitored her closely for any signs of a reaction. Claire tried to stay calm, distracting herself with a book, but her mind kept drifting to the what-ifs. When the first session ended, Dr. Morgan sat beside her. "You did great, Claire. Now we wait and see how your body responds. It might take a few days to notice any changes." Claire nodded, exhaustion washing over her. Karen stayed by her side, holding her hand as they drove home. That night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't shake a sense of unease. She wanted to believe the treatment would work, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, clutching her ribs. The pain was unlike anything she'd felt before. Intense, searing, and radiating through her entire body. She tried to call for her mom, but the words wouldn't come. As darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, Claire realized something was very wrong. The last thing Claire remembered was the sharp, unrelenting pain. When she opened her eyes, she was in a hospital bed, the sterile smell and rhythmic beeping of monitors grounding her in an all-too-familiar setting. Her mom sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly, her eyes puffy and red. "Mom?" Claire croaked, her voice hoarse. Karen's head shot up, relief flooding her face. "Claire. Oh, thank God. You scared me half to death. What happened?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Morgan entered the room, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Claire, you had a severe reaction to the treatment. It caused a sudden inflammatory response in your connective tissues. We had to act quickly to stabilize you." Claire's heart sank. Did I mess everything up?" "No," Dr. Morgan said firmly. "You didn't mess anything up. This is part of the process. It's why we're monitoring you so closely." Karen interjected, her voice trembling with emotion. "But, Dr. Morgan, this was supposed to be safe. My daughter almost—" She broke off, unable to say the words. "I know," Dr. Morgan said gently, "and I'm so sorry this happened. We've adjusted the protocol to prevent another reaction like this. But it's up to you both whether you want to continue." Claire's mind spun. The memory of the pain was still fresh, but so was the determination she had felt when she agreed to the trial. She looked at her mom, then back at Dr. Morgan. "If we stop now, what happens?" Dr. Morgan sighed. "We won't have enough data to determine if the treatment can work. But your safety is the most important thing. No one will fault you if you decide to stop. Karen looked at Claire, her eyes pleading. Sweetheart, you don't have to do this. You've already done so much. Claire hesitated, her chest tightening. The thought of quitting felt like a failure, not just for herself, but for everyone who was counting on her. But the fear of another reaction was real. I need to think about it, Claire said finally, her voice shaky. The next few days were a blur of rest and recovery. Claire tried to distract herself with books and movies, but her mind kept returning to the same question. Should she continue the trial? The support group rallied around her, sending messages of encouragement and reminding her that the decision was hers alone. One evening, Claire received a video message from Leo. His face lit up the screen, his smile infectious. Hey, Claire. I heard about what happened, and I just wanted to say you're amazing. Like, superhero-level amazing. You've already done so much for people like me, and if you need to take a break, that's okay. Just know we all believe in you. Claire watched the video twice, her heart swelling with gratitude. Leo's words reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. But the fear lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. A week later, Claire returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment. Dr. Morgan met her in the consultation room, her demeanor calm and professional. How are you feeling, Claire? Better, Claire said. But I'm still scared. That's completely normal, Dr. Morgan said. Fear is a natural response to what you've been through. But fear doesn't have to define your choices. Claire looked at her mom, who nodded encouragingly. I'll support you no matter what, Claire. Claire took a deep breath, her hands trembling. If we try again, will it be different? We've adjusted the dosage and the method of administration, Dr. Morgan explained. It should minimize the risk of another reaction. But as with any experimental treatment, there are no guarantees. Claire nodded, her mind made up. I want to keep going, but if something goes wrong again, I'll stop. Dr. Morgan smiled, admiration shining in her eyes. That's brave, Claire. We'll take every precaution to make this as safe as possible. The next round of treatment was scheduled for the following week. This time, Claire was prepped with additional medications to reduce the risk of inflammation. The procedure itself was shorter and less intense, but the hours afterward felt endless as she waited for any sign of a reaction. By the time she was discharged, Claire felt cautiously optimistic. The pain and fatigue she had experienced after the first treatment were gone, replaced by a strange sense of lightness. For the first time in months, her joints didn't ache constantly, and the bruises on her arms seemed to fade faster than usual. When she reported these changes to Dr. Morgan during her next visit, the doctor's excitement was palpable. This is exactly what we were hoping for, she said. It's still early, but these are promising results. Claire felt a spark of hope, but she kept her expectations grounded. Does this mean it's working? It's too soon to say for sure, Dr. Morgan cautioned. But we're moving in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, Claire's energy levels improved, and her symptoms continued to lessen. She returned to the mentorship program, where she was welcomed back with open arms. Even the hospital administrators who had once been hesitant seemed impressed by her resilience. But just as things began to settle, Claire received an unexpected phone call one evening. It was Dr. Morgan, and her tone was serious. Claire, we've been reviewing the latest data from your treatment, she said. There's something unusual happening. Something we didn't anticipate. Claire's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The mutation we've been targeting is responding to the treatment, but it's also interacting with other parts of your genetic code in ways we don't fully understand, Dr. Morgan explained. It's not dangerous, at least, not yet, but it could lead to changes we didn't predict. Claire gripped the phone tightly. What kind of changes? We don't know, Dr. Morgan admitted, but I want to run some additional tests to make sure we're not missing anything. Claire nodded, even though Dr. Morgan couldn't see her. Okay, let's do the tests. As she hung up, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The stakes were higher than ever, and for the first time, she wondered if she had crossed into uncharted territory where even the experts couldn't predict what would happen next. The next morning, Claire and Karen arrived at the hospital for the additional tests. The atmosphere felt heavier than usual, as though everyone in the building sensed the weight of the unknown. Dr. Morgan greeted them at the entrance, her demeanor calm but her eyes betraying a hint of worry. "Claire, today we're going to do a comprehensive genetic scan and some advanced imaging to see exactly how your body is responding to the treatment," Dr. Morgan explained. "This will give us a clearer picture of what's happening." Claire nodded, trying to stay brave. Karen squeezed her hand as they followed Dr. Morgan to the lab. The room was filled with sleek machines humming softly, their lights blinking rhythmically. Claire climbed onto the imaging table, the cool surface sending a shiver through her. "We'll be here the whole time," Karen said, brushing a strand of hair from Claire's face. "You've got this." The tests took hours. Claire lay still as the machines scanned every inch of her body, analyzing her cells and tissues down to the molecular level. The repetitive hum of the equipment was almost hypnotic, giving Claire too much time to think. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Not wrong, necessarily, but different. Finally, the scans were complete. Dr. Morgan and her team reviewed the data while Claire and Karen waited in a nearby lounge. The minutes dragged by like hours, the silence between them filled with unspoken fears. When Dr. Morgan returned, she carried a tablet loaded with images and data. Her expression was a mix of excitement and caution. "What did you find?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Dr. Morgan pulled up an image on the tablet. It showed a detailed scan of Claire's connective tissues, with areas highlighted in bright colors. "Your body is responding to the treatment in ways we didn't anticipate," she began. "The targeted mutation is being repaired, but it's also triggering changes in your collagen production. Essentially, your tissues are becoming stronger and more elastic than normal." Karen frowned. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Dr. Morgan hesitated. "It's unprecedented. On one hand, it could mean a significant improvement in Claire's quality of life. But on the other hand, we don't know the long-term effects. Her body is essentially adapting to the treatment in ways we've never seen before." Claire stared at the image, a mix of awe and apprehension. "So, I'm changing?" "Yes," Dr. Morgan said gently. "But we'll be monitoring you closely to make sure those changes remain positive." As they drove home, Claire couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Morgan had said. Her body was changing. What did that even mean? She couldn't help but feel like she was caught between two worlds, the girl she had been and the person she was becoming. That night, Claire sat at her desk, flipping through her binder of medical notes. She added a new section labeled Experimental Treatment and began documenting everything she knew about her condition and the trial. It was her way of taking control in a situation that felt increasingly uncertain. Over the next few weeks, Claire noticed subtle changes in her body. Her joints no longer dislocated as easily, and her skin seemed more resilient. Tasks that had once been exhausting, like carrying her school books or climbing stairs, became manageable. For the first time in years, she felt almost normal. But the changes weren't all physical. Claire found herself thinking more clearly, solving problems faster, and retaining information more easily. Her already sharp mind seemed to be operating on a new level, as though the treatment had unlocked something within her. At first, Claire welcomed the improvements. She excelled in her mentorship program, impressing even the most skeptical doctors with her insights. But the more she stood out, the more isolated she felt. The whispers started again, and this time, they weren't just about her age, they were about what she was becoming. One afternoon, Claire was called to assist with a complicated case involving a young girl named Emily. Emily had been born with a rare form of vascular Ehlers-Danlos and was experiencing severe internal bleeding. The medical team was struggling to stabilize her, and Dr. Morgan brought Claire in to consult. "Claire," Dr. Morgan said, handing her the girl's chart, "we need your perspective. You've been in Emily's shoes, and your insights could make the difference here." Claire scanned the chart, her mind racing. The symptoms were severe, but something about them didn't add up. "It's not just her blood vessels," she said finally. "Her platelets are low. You need to address the clotting issue too." Dr. Morgan nodded, relaying the suggestion to the team. Within minutes, Emily's condition began to stabilize, and Claire felt a surge of relief. But as she watched the girl's parents thank the doctors through the observation window, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a dangerous line. That evening, Claire confided in Karen. Mom, what if this is too much? What if I'm becoming something I don't even recognize? Karen pulled her into a hug. Claire, you're still you. You're just growing into the amazing person you were always meant to be. But what if I'm not meant to be normal anymore? Claire asked, her voice cracking. What if I'm becoming different? Karen held her tightly, tears brimming in her eyes. Different doesn't mean bad, sweetheart. It just means you're extraordinary. And no matter what happens, I'll be right here with you. Just as Claire began to find peace with her new reality, an unexpected crisis threw everything into chaos. Late one night, as she was reviewing research data in her room, her phone buzzed with an urgent notification. It was a message from Dr. Morgan. Claire, we need you at the hospital immediately. It's about the treatment. Call me as soon as you see this. Claire's heart raced as she dialed Dr. Morgan's number. The doctor answered on the first ring, her voice tense. Claire, we've detected an anomaly in the latest data. We need to run additional tests right away. What kind of anomaly? Claire asked, dread creeping into her voice. Dr. Morgan hesitated. It's unusual. It might explain why your body is responding the way it is, but it could also mean there's a risk we didn't foresee. I'll be there as soon as I can, Claire said, her resolve hardening. As she hung up, she knew this was more than just a routine follow-up. Whatever Dr. Morgan had discovered, it could change everything, not just for Claire, but for the future of the treatment itself. And this time, the stakes felt higher than ever. Claire arrived at the hospital within the hour, still dressed in her pajamas and clutching a hoodie against the brisk night air. Karen was at her side, her expression a mixture of worry and determination. Dr. Morgan met them at the entrance, looking more serious than Claire had ever seen her. Claire, thank you for coming so quickly, Dr. Morgan said. We've been analyzing your most recent data, and there's something we need to discuss in person. What did you find? Claire asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Dr. Morgan gestured for them to follow her to a private consultation room. Once inside, she pulled up a series of charts and scans on a large screen. The images displayed intricate, colorful diagrams of Claire's DNA and cellular activity. Your body is doing something we didn't anticipate, Dr. Morgan began. The treatment is repairing your mutated collagen, as expected, but it's also triggering an overproduction of certain proteins. These proteins are enhancing your cell's ability to heal and regenerate. Karen frowned. Isn't that a good thing? In theory, yes, Dr. Morgan said, but the speed and scale of these changes are unprecedented. Claire's body is adapting so quickly that it's essentially rewriting how her connective tissues function. Claire stared at the screen, the implications sinking in. So, what does that mean for me? Dr. Morgan hesitated. We're not entirely sure. On one hand, it could mean your condition will improve significantly, perhaps even to the point where it's no longer a limitation. But on the other hand, rapid changes like this can strain the body in unexpected ways. Karen's voice was sharp. What kind of strain? Organ function, immune response, even neurological changes, Dr. Morgan admitted. We're monitoring everything closely, but we need to prepare for the possibility of side effects. Claire's hands trembled as she processed the information. She had always wanted to feel normal, to live without the constant shadow of Ehlers-Danlos. But this was something entirely different. What do we do now? We keep monitoring, Dr. Morgan said, and we adjust the treatment protocol to minimize risks. But Claire, I need to be honest with you. This is uncharted territory. You're the first person to experience these changes, and we're learning as we go. The following days were a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and late-night discussions. Claire's body continued to show remarkable changes. Her joint pain disappeared entirely, her energy levels soared, and even her scars began to fade. But with each improvement came a growing sense of unease. Her mind felt sharper, her reflexes quicker. During a mentorship session, Claire surprised herself by solving a complex medical puzzle before the attending physician had even finished explaining it. The doctors praised her brilliance, but Claire felt more like an outsider than ever. One evening, Claire decided to confide in her support group. I don't feel like myself anymore, she admitted during a video call. It's like my body and my brain are moving faster than I can keep up with. Ryan, the older teen in the group, offered a reassuring smile. You're going through something huge, Claire. It's okay to feel off balance. Mia chimed in. Yeah, you're still you. You're just a supercharged version of yourself. The group's encouragement helped, but Claire still couldn't shake the feeling that she was becoming someone, or something, she didn't fully understand. The tipping point came during a routine mentorship session in the ER. Claire was shadowing a trauma team when a patient came in with a life-threatening condition, multiple organ failure caused by a rare autoimmune disorder. The doctors were scrambling, trying to stabilize the patient, but nothing seemed to work. Claire stood on the sidelines, her mind racing. She studied the monitors, the patient's chart, and the doctor's actions, piecing together the puzzle in her head. Suddenly, she saw it, the missing piece. It's his blood, Claire blurted out, stepping forward. He's reacting to a medication in his system. You need to filter it out and replace it with plasma. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at her. One of the doctors, Dr. Patel, frowned. Claire, this is a high-stakes situation. Are you sure? Yes, Claire said firmly. Look at his chart. His enzyme levels are spiking. It's a classic drug reaction. Dr. Patel hesitated for only a moment before giving the order. Within minutes, the patient's vitals began to stabilize. The team let out a collective sigh of relief, but Claire felt no satisfaction. Instead, she felt the weight of what she had done. As the adrenaline faded, Claire's legs wobbled, and she slumped against the wall. Dr. Patel caught her, concern etched on his face. Claire, are you okay? I think so, she said, her voice shaky. I just need a minute. Dr. Morgan appeared moments later, having been alerted to the situation. Claire, what happened? She saved a life, Dr. Patel said, his tone both impressed and cautious. But she looks like she's about to collapse. Dr. Morgan helped Claire to a chair, her expression a mix of pride and worry. Claire, you need to take a break. You can't keep pushing yourself like this. I'm fine, Claire insisted, though her pale face and trembling hands told a different story. Claire, Dr. Morgan said gently, you're extraordinary, but you're also human. Let us take care of you for once. That night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the events in the ER. She had saved a life, but at what cost? The changes in her body and mind were undeniable, and the pressure to live up to everyone's expectations was crushing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Morgan. We need to talk tomorrow. There's been another development with your genetic data. Claire's heart sank. She knew this wasn't over. Whatever was happening to her was bigger than she had imagined. And deep down, she feared that the next revelation might change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The next morning, Claire arrived at Dr. Morgan's office, bracing herself for whatever news awaited. Karen was by her side, her protective instincts on high alert. Dr. Morgan greeted them with a grim expression, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. Claire, Karen, thank you for coming, Dr. Morgan began, her voice steady but serious. We've analyzed the latest data, and we've made a significant discovery about what's happening to Claire. What is it? Karen asked, gripping Claire's hand tightly. Dr. Morgan took a deep breath. Claire's body is adapting to the treatment in ways that go beyond what we anticipated. The mutation we've been targeting isn't just repairing her collagen production, it's enhancing her entire cellular structure. Essentially, her body is evolving to operate at a higher level. Claire blinked. Evolving? What does that even mean? It means your cells are regenerating faster, your tissues are stronger, and your brain is processing information more efficiently, Dr. Morgan explained. You've become something unique, a step beyond what we thought was possible. Karen's face paled. Is it dangerous? We don't believe so, Dr. Morgan said quickly, but it's uncharted territory. Claire is the first person to undergo these changes, and we don't know what the long-term effects will be. Claire sat back, her mind racing. She thought of the moments when her mind felt sharper, her body felt stronger, and her instincts had saved lives. It was exhilarating, but also terrifying. What do we do now? She asked. Dr. Morgan hesitated. That's up to you. We can continue the treatment, carefully monitoring your progress, or we can stop and let your body stabilize where it is now. Either way, You'll need ongoing support to navigate these changes. Karen looked at Claire, her eyes filled with concern. Sweetheart, this is your decision. Whatever you choose, I'm here for you. Claire spent the next few days wrestling with the choice. The idea of continuing the treatment was tempting. She had always dreamed of living without pain, of being able to help others without limits. But the unknown loomed large. What if the changes spiraled out of control? What if she became someone she no longer recognized? During a support group meeting, Claire shared her dilemma. I feel like I'm carrying the weight of the world, she admitted. What if I mess this up? What if I make the wrong choice? Ryan offered a reassuring smile. Claire, you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever you decide, you've already done more than anyone could have asked for. Mia added, and no matter what happens, you're still you. Don't forget that. Their words gave Claire a sense of clarity. She realized she didn't need to have all the answers, not yet. She just needed to follow her instincts. The next morning, Claire met with Dr. Morgan and Karen to give her decision. I want to stop the treatment, she said firmly. I need to let my body adjust to what's already happened before we do anything else. Dr. Morgan nodded, her expression one of respect. That's a wise choice, Claire. We'll continue to monitor you and provide any support you need. Karen let out a sigh of relief, pulling Claire into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Claire smiled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had regained control over her life. In the weeks that followed, Claire's life began to stabilize. She returned to the mentorship program, focusing on research and observation rather than high-stakes emergencies. Her enhanced abilities didn't fade, but she learned to manage them, using her gifts to help others in a way that felt sustainable. The support group became her refuge, a place where she could share her triumphs and struggles without fear of judgment. Leo, now fully recovered, often joined the meetings, his gratitude a constant reminder of why Claire had chosen this path. One day, Dr. Morgan approached Claire with a proposal. We've started a new initiative to study rare genetic conditions, and we'd like you to be a part of it. Not as a subject, but as a researcher. Claire's eyes widened. You mean, like a real scientist? Exactly, Dr. Morgan said. Your insights have already saved lives, Claire. Imagine what you could do with the right tools and support. Claire glanced at her mom, who nodded encouragingly. I'd love that, she said, a smile spreading across her face. As Claire walked through the hospital halls that afternoon, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey had been anything but ordinary, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. She had faced fear, pain, and uncertainty, but she had emerged stronger, both in body and spirit. And though her path was still unfolding, one thing was clear. Claire wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and she was ready to face whatever came next.